Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CPOA's first webinar. This will be our third Alzheimer's awareness seminar, but this year we're obviously taking a different format. Who would have thought that as we sat this time last year at Sea Point Retirement Complex, listening to the presenters, that this year we would be in our own homes or workspaces, separate from one another and managing the COVID crisis. Times have certainly changed, but we are cautiously optimistic that we have weathered the storm and are now returning to a new sense of normality. CPOA owns retirement complexes and care centres in and around the Western Cape. CPOA has a strong team of professionals heading up the company, as well as a group of passionate and energetic managers and nursing managers who are specialists in the retirement industry and geriatric care. CPOA has 5 dedicated memory care centres, one at Sea Point Place, one at Anchusa in Meadow Ridge, one at Arvandrist in Rondebosch, and Tryon is in Deep River, as well as one in Lotus River. These centres have been specifically designed to ensure the safety of our residents, yet allowing for a nurturing and comfortable environment. Staff are trained in specialised dementia care, and their daily activities are specifically designed to be suitable for residents with cognitive challenges. In 2020, we are again delighted to introduce our speakers, each of whom has extensive involvement and interaction with the elderly and those with dementia. We are so privileged that our speakers came through to visit us today and offering their time to assist us in gaining insight and knowledge into this disease. My name is Sister Louise Nix, and I'm the Nursing Services Manager at the CPOA. I will also be your host for the webinar this morning. I would just like to remind you that there will be a question and answer section at the end of the presentations. But if you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so during the webinar. Just pop your question on the screen. There is a tab at the bottom of your screen, but please just say who you would like the question to be directed to. I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Karen Barakovich, who is the founder and executive director of Dementia SA. Dementia SA provides a 24-hour helpline, raises awareness nationally, and is actively involved in research and ongoing advocacy. Karen is going to talk to us today about a subject which may have posed more of a challenge than the actual COVID pandemic. The elderly residing in residential facilities have not been allowed visitors since the commencement of lockdown, and this has had a great impact on the residents themselves as well as their loved ones. I welcome Karen now. She's going to be speaking about locked down or locked out.
Thank you so much, Sister Nix. It's wonderful, wonderful to be here. And you know, it's a strange thing to sit in front of a screen and not see people's reaction and not see people's understanding and you know, nodding or, you know, sort of not agreeing or whatever. So it really is, it's almost like chatting to a vacuum, but I know that I'm not. I know that there's interested, engaged people, you know, out there who certainly are there, and it's certainly our pleasure as Dementia SA to be part of this process. And I think that it's a really strange way in which the world is moving, that things are almost slightly distant. And that's maybe, you know, the point that I'm going to start off with. My talk is really, it's exactly about lockdown and locked out, the feeling of families during COVID-19. And I think the very interesting thing is that, you know, not only was I at Dementia SA and our whole team dealing with people who were, you know, at their homes or in their homes or in care facilities, residential care facilities. And I'm really going to be speaking from my heart, from what I have seen happening in families and how dislocated families are. besides the fact that they have a loved one with Alzheimer's or a dementia, it certainly was a time when they were not only dealing with a disease process, but they were also dealing with things that were out of their control. And I think that's really where I'm going to start. I think that the whole pandemic certainly brought about this huge uncertainty. And we probably in 80 years or so, 90 years, 100 years, haven't really dealt with pandemics per se. So I think from a reference point, there wasn't really anything that we really could refer back to or say, you know, we know what to expect. And I think that uncertainty, you know, what can we expect? How long is it going to be? What are my individual reactions? What is my individual fear around the unknown? And I think that, you know, many people had started having conversations around that lockdown, which in a way were positive, and in another realm, some were very negative. Many of the residential care facilities had already locked down 2, 3, 4 weeks sometimes before hard lockdown. And I think that too, you know, that additional separation from loved ones, from family members, also added to that feeling of the unknown, and certainly around the feelings of fear. And how do we deal with fear? So, you know, there is always the fight or flight or frozen. And I think many people were really frozen because we didn't know what to expect. And we hadn't dealt with a pandemic like this before. The fact that it was happening in other countries, and there were these huge media reports about the numbers of deaths and not enough ventilators and not enough this and not enough PPE, just kept building our fear as to, well, what are we going to do in South Africa? And how are we going to manage? And, you know, our health system is not really very, is not very well developed. So how are we going to go from here? How are we going to deal with all of these things? If we can't be tested, we knew that there were long waits in testing. So what really was the solution for us down in the deep south in Africa? And I must say that once it really started, and we started with the hard lockdown, which we knew we had to do, and we all had to take it in as being, you know, one of the next steps that we had to go through. It really was extremely difficult. No longer was the conversation around global warming. The conversation was now about global mourning. We knew that there was, you know, everybody was dying, that, you know, families weren't connected anymore, that we weren't able to kind of physically see each other, have that connection, even if it was have a cup of tea or have a cup of coffee, that kept us connected and kept us engaged. So I think that there again, we go back very much like somebody who takes care of a loved one with dementia. We go back to the model of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, of the stages of mourning and the stages of loss. And I think that's really where the global mourning not only meant, you know, the actual loss of connection within our small family unit, but it really started to affect our family and the economy, the greater economy, of being the loss of jobs, the loss of economies, the loss of the loss and the escalation of seeing more and more people struggle. And I think that, you know, in the South African context, South Africans really came to the rescue of some of the communities around, you know, around South Africa. You know, we saw an outpouring of Ubuntu. We saw an outpouring of love and understanding, a sense of community. You know, where I stay in Higgovale, many of the community members came together. We supported the local businesses that had to close down. They started to make a number of meals just to be able to keep and pay their staff. which we all bought and we all contributed to and we all supported. And I think that was really the connection point. You know, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross speaks about her 5 stages of loss, obviously, you know, the denial is one of the biggest. You know, this comes at a time where I haven't experienced this before. How am I expected to respond to that? And one of the things is that, you know, we kept having people say, you know, we've just got to be stoic, we've got to take this on, we've got to be positive, and we've got to do this and this. But how positive can one actually be where you actually feel that, you know, I'm all positived out, you know, and there's just no way that I can only see doom and gloom. And, you know, we had many people phone us on our national helpline during this time. And one of the things was, you know, how much television are you watching? How much are you exposing yourself to things that are out of your control? And I think therein lies the crux of coronavirus is, you know, there are certain things that we just cannot control. And it's that feeling of not being in control that we really do feel that we are locked out. We don't feel that we can participate. We don't feel that we can connect and we can engage. But out of that whole scenario is the thing of, well, maybe if I had to replace what I'm seeing on the media, and that is really distressing me. I have a neighbor who phoned me, who's 75, who phoned me probably 3-4 times a day to tell me that had I heard there were more deaths. What are they going to do about this? We're 2 weeks into lockdown. We're 3 weeks into lockdown. We're 4 weeks into lockdown. And you know what, at the end of the day, those are all things that certainly, you know, are things that we realize and that we know. But it's exactly how do we continue to go about things where we feel that we are still in a positive space, but all that we are surrounded by and the messages that we're surrounded by are certainly all negative. And I think that was the difficult balance between that. For somebody who is older and that was in a residential care facility, for example, that remaining positive was more and more difficult, because this is something that we kept hearing, that the elderly are at greater risk. The elderly are at greater risk. You know, your age, the elderly are at greater risk. And we kept hearing it over and over again. And yes, the elderly were at greater risk, but I think that we need to draw some kind of line in the sand here. And that those two with non-communicable diseases, NCDs, were at greater risk with heart disease, with diabetes, with a whole lot of other, you know, comorbidities that brought the risk level and the risk age down significantly. So here was a group of people who were already vulnerable and who already are have the fear of this unknown, this unseen, this you know, how do I deal with this? Feeling even more isolated and even more vulnerable and even more locked out than what they usually are. The other thing that I found is that, you know, when we speak about the anger, you know, what is going to happen? How is this going to resolve itself? We heard of the escalating numbers and figures in Italy. Then in America, it was taking hold. Then it was taking hold somewhere else. It just seemed that everybody else was dealing with the same, but, you know, how are we all dealing with the lot that we have? This is all out of control. It's not fair. And how are we going to continue dealing with it? That part of the anger, you know, where does this all come from? And then we dealt with the guilt. Well, you know, why is it that, you know, it's South Africa, and why is it that my mother has to be locked up? You know, I should have actually brought her home before, and we didn't know at that time that lockdown was going to continue. It was initially only for 21 days, and then it got greater and greater and greater. And I think that there was a lot of guilt in a lot of families that they actually felt that they really needed, they should have almost, they felt that they had to rescue their loved one before the pandemic got out of control and before the lockdown was extended. And I think that's really, that was the difficult thing. Then there was the bargaining. And I'm sure that many residential care facilities had a lot of that from families. You know, well, let me take my mom now, or let me take my dad now. And then, you know, you don't have to worry about them. You don't have to, you know, let's try and resolve this. Then you don't have that responsibility. We as family will take that responsibility. But sometimes those family members are never seen during the entire 365 years of any other, especially when you need, you know, them to just come and visit for Mother's Day or for Father's Day or for, you know, just once a month even. Those families are not around. So the type of bargaining that went on, and I think that went on in some families and that we counseled some people through, was exactly that. And I think a lot of people's faith, they either question their faith as to whether this is a true and just God or a spiritual head that they have to deal with, or how is it that, you know, I'm going to be able for God to see my side of things? Does God really know the impact that this is having on our family? You know, our major breadwinner has lost his job. We're not getting UIF. We all together, the kids are eating more food than they usually do. We're having to keep them busy with all sorts of things. It's a whole new type of living, a type of being as a family. So I think there really is the phrase, the new normal, or pivoting, or changing, or those kinds of phrases were things that we heard very, very often. And I must say that certainly in some cases, the creativity that we saw that came out of some of these situations was quite phenomenal. You know, there were people that took on banana bread challenges, and we saw them Zooming and, you know, baking and baking and baking. Yeast was sold out all over the place, because not only were they baking bread, but they were also making some of the alcohol and some of the alcohol-based things that we sort of didn't have access to. So I think that there was a lot of this. Being accepting of what is going on, where people actually started to call it the new normal, and this is the reality. But there again, that was underpinned by the fear of how long is this going to continue for? How long is this new normal going to continue? So I think that finding the creativity in doing things in a different way, and I think that people who have cared for somebody with dementia or who are in that space certainly know about that. You know that there's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to dementia. And I actually found the families that were taking care of people living with dementia at home were far easier and more available to try new creative ideas, because they had the time. They had the time to spend to explore something about their loved one that they possibly had never done before. Children were there. So you had this intergenerational play, which was so amazing. And I think out of that, if anything, came out of COVID-19 in families where people with dementia were cared for at home, it was exactly that. It was the intergenerational play and how important that is. And then also the understanding of how we need to step up to the plate to just push over the edge and to try something new and something more creative. And by creative, I'm not saying, you know, necessarily with crafts and things like that, but just doing things in a different way. And I think that really was the secret to unlocking how some families actually coped. So, but for carers and the older generation, particularly those that were still in care facilities, the fear of the technology, the use of the technology, where we'll say, oh, Ma, we'll Zoom you in, or we'll FaceTime you, or we'll link you up via video. Many care facilities and care homes, that was something new. So, well, whose phone do we use? Which data do we use? How do we actually facilitate this? How do we say, Tani, kyk na die camera. Hier is die camera hierso. But they don't see the camera as the camera that they know. The little camera is a tiny, tiny little lens that's built into the screen. So there were a number of things where the technology, whilst the technology is there, it became very, very difficult for families to, speak to their loved ones within care facilities. I must say some care facilities were absolutely amazing. And you could phone and you could leave voice messages, and they had a dedicated line, and, that was fantastic. And families could send through photographs, etc., etc. So there again, the use of creativity and the use of being able to embrace and take it on was unbelievable. But I think that we did have to understand that there is still the vulnerability and the fear of the technology that certainly was there. Overall, the sadness that embraced everybody, whether you had felt it, you could understand it as a global pandemic and see and understand in a fairly rational way what was happening around the world, what really was happening in your world, particularly if you had a loved one that was in a care facility. I admire all care facilities that have been able to work through the COVID-19 pandemic. I think each and every one of those nurses, those, the kitchen staff, from the highest to the very basic person that provides some kind of care and love and support to somebody that was in a care facility, I applaud and salute you all, because I think that you were dealing with multiple things on multiple different levels, not only the medical side of things and the nursing side of things and the risks involved in that, but also dealing with families that possibly their fear levels were out of control. And I think that too added to all of that. So the situation, as we know, was abnormal and traumatic. And we had to adapt to a whole new way of teaching our loved ones in either a home setting or in a care facility setting, different changes in behavior. So it might have brought a lot of fear amongst them. Why do I have to wash my hands so much? But I've just done that. And washing hands, sanitizing, hands becoming very leathery and hard, cuticles in ladies becoming very hard because of the sanitizer and the alcohol. Distancing, what is social distancing to somebody with dementia? They like to hook in and walk down the passage, but all of a sudden there were masks. I couldn't see this person. I couldn't recognize them. I didn't know. This is something out of a movie that I possibly might have seen 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when, they had all those very scary movies with pandemics and all sorts of things. So all of these fears were kind of almost reinforced, but in real time and in the real issues. The one thing that has come from COVID-19, which I think has been a positive around the world, is the fact that those that have developed some kind of mental illness through a depression, through some kind of sadness, acknowledgement of feelings, acknowledgement that things are out of control, the highlight in terms of mental illness has become a real positive for the world. We now understand how it must feel for somebody who feels alone, because whilst that person may feel that loneliness and that vulnerability and sadness in their own head and in their own mind, we were dealing with it in the spaces that we live in, that are familiar to us. Our bedrooms, our kitchens, our own homes, even with our pets around us, even with family that lived with us, or that live with us. So I think that, the positive has been that people have been able to address their feelings and have really come to the party to understand that, maybe it's not quite normal to feel as abnormal as I do feel, but maybe I can allow it to be able to be expressed. And I actually now know I have empathy for somebody that has a mental illness. And I think that too, if one looks at that in the context of, pardon me, looks at that in the context of somebody taking care of somebody with dementia, we all see that sadness. We've all experienced that sadness. It might have been in COVID-19, but I think that what we have realized is that to be able to take what we feel and how we react to that and respond to that, it is all around that. So in closing, I really would like to just say that, many people say, oh, you know what, we're all in the same boat. We might all have been in the same boat, but we're in the same storm, but in a different boat. Some might have been in a cruise liner where things were a little bit easier. Some were in a rickety raft that sometimes couldn't really even get to the end of the next day. But at the end of the day, we were all in the same storm, but in different boats. I'd like to end off with a quote from Pema Chodron that says, "Let difficulty transform you, and it will." In my experience, we just need help in learning now not to run away. And I think that is really the understanding of COVID within our lives as we see it now, and in the lives of our loved ones, and having greater respect for each other, greater understanding of people with mental illness, people with loneliness issues, people that felt sad, and having some kind of respect for the incredible work that people do in amongst your family, firstly, if you care for somebody at home, but also for those that care for our loved ones in residential care facilities. Thank you so, so much. I'm humbled. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. You made reference to screen fatigue, where we are now dealing with screens as opposed to faces and lacking human touch and connection. Thank you so much for offering insight, highlighting the difficulties of the unknown, which have been so frightening, and the frenzy of fear, and summarizing the impact and how we as South Africans have opened our hearts. I also saw that you brought the crisis into comparison against the 5 stages of mourning, which has helped me make more sense of the situation. You also gave names to the feelings that many people have experienced: anger, guilt, sadness, bargaining. And I do believe by affirming people's feelings, you assist in saying that it's okay to feel this way and it's normal. I do appreciate your acknowledgement of the pressures experienced from all levels for the staff at our care homes. We certainly are proud of our staff on the ground managing the new norm. Thank you for speaking from the heart. I would now like to invite you to partake in our live poll, which will be appearing on your screen. This will assist us in gathering of information in order to adapt our service offering. Please go ahead. The question is, would you consider home-based care or care in a facility for your loved one? We're just waiting for the results. Sure, it's quite an interesting result actually. We have 55% of attendees wishing for home-based care and 52% saying care centre facilities. So it's quite an even run there. Thank you for partaking in that. It is now time to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Alice Ashwell, whose journey with dementia started when her mom was diagnosed with this disease. Dr. Ashwell is an educator, a facilitator, and a life coach. She owns Dementia Connections, which provides education and support for those who love and care for people living with dementia. She also runs a coaching practice called Heart of Nature. Dr. Ashwell will be discussing how to ensure our loved ones with dementia can live safely and calmly within a loving environment. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Sister Nix, and I can quite understand why Karen was a bit discombobulated by the lack of being able to see you all, but I am so grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. And I've had a look at some of the questions that have come through prior to this webinar, and I'm hoping that my presentation will actually answer quite a lot of them. Because I think for many of us, dementia is one of those conditions that bears a stigma. And conditions that bear a stigma are those things we don't want to face. We don't want to become curious about them until we're forced to. But as Karen so wisely said, we've all been getting a taste of things like loneliness during this time, and are starting to understand that we can stand in the shoes of people who suffer with conditions that perhaps we haven't actually wanted to consider in the past. So I thought what I would do is start with a question about what actually is dementia, because very often I'll get the question, is it dementia or Alzheimer's? Because those are two quite well-known terms that relate to this condition. But because we haven't become curious about dementia, we're not sure about the details. So on the screen, I hope you can see some very famous people. I often say that if you or a loved one of yours gets dementia, you're in very highly esteemed company, because some very famous people have developed dementia in their older years. For example, Ronald Reagan, as you will well know, the US president from many years ago, who died with Alzheimer's disease, which is one of the most common forms of dementia. So let's just use this as the opportunity. The other person I've put up here, Rosa Parks. You see Martin Luther King in the background. Some of you will know she was the African-American woman who refused to give up her seat in the bus during segregation and was an activist at that time. She too had Alzheimer's disease. So the different types of conditions I'm going to share with you now are just a few of the specific kind of neurological conditions that we call collectively dementia. And dementia is essentially a loss of function caused by changes in the brain, which can express as, for example, very commonly a loss of memory, but also a loss of capacity, the ability to do everyday things that we take for granted. And they can also affect things like our mood and behavior, so that we come across strangely and people are surprised by our reactions. Now, Alzheimer's disease is one of the most common forms of dementia, of which there are probably over 100 different types. And it characteristically starts with a loss of short-term memory, due to the fact that a part of the brain that is responsible for the formation of memories is one of the first to be affected. And so when we find ourselves unable to remember what we just did, or where we put our keys, or we're on our way somewhere and we actually can't remember where we're going, or we can't actually follow a complex conversation, this may be an early sign of Alzheimer's. And it will progress through the brain, and eventually by the late stages of the disease will be even affecting things like our ability to swallow, or our ability to walk around properly as we used to be able to do. It's very, very common and can come on early sometimes in one's 50s or 60s even, but more characteristically in the latter years. Another form that was probably a kind of Alzheimer's, but there is also a specific form of dementia where a person loses their ability to speak. And Emerson, who was a wonderful nature philosopher in the 1800s in the United States, can you imagine what it must be for a philosopher to be unable to speak? All his life has been about sharing insights and ideas, and suddenly he loses his speech capacity. Aphasia is also a feature of the later stage of Alzheimer's, when people lose their home language. And I know with my mum, she had a mixture of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And in the end, really it was a sort of a babbling because she'd lost so many of her words. A very common form of dementia in South Africa, where we have a very high instance anyway of cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, strokes, hypertension, is vascular dementia. It's the dementia that affects the blood vessels in the brain, or basically is caused by the compromising of blood vessels in the brain. And you will find very often in this case that a person may not have a massive stroke, but they have a series of mini strokes. And those little mini strokes start compromising, start damaging different parts of the brain. And interestingly, whereas Alzheimer's will tend to progress in quite a smooth manner, going downhill basically, in vascular dementia, you'll have changes that relate to the instance of this mini stroke or TIA. And so you'll find a stepwise change happening in that person's life. And it'll be a little bit more unpredictable in terms of the changes that take place related to the different parts of the brain that might be affected. Another one that I've found quite common in South Africa in support groups that I've been involved with, and very often, just from a completely anecdotal point of view, I've found it tends to have been something that has affected a lot of men, is frontotemporal dementia. In that case, the frontal lobes of the brain, we'll talk about a bit more just now, are very much involved with personality, with mood, with restraint. And that when you find a person becoming, should we say, more of who they were, so if they had a bit of an anger issue, now it's even got worse, you might find that the problem is in the front of the brain, which is that part that manages our personality issues. On the other side of the brain, at the back of the brain, is the area that is responsible for us interpreting what we see. And PCA, which stands for posterior, that's the back of the brain, cortical, that's the gray matter, atrophy, that's breaking down of or disintegrating. At the back of the brain, you get a very rare form of dementia which impacts on your ability to interpret what you're seeing. And here again, can you imagine Terry Pratchett, this world-famous author whose whole life and livelihood has been about words on a page, suddenly developing a form of dementia which makes it impossible for you to read, to interpret what you're seeing. There are also types of dementia that are related to actual physical blows to the head, trauma. And so traumatic brain injuries, apologies, like, for example, in the case of contact sports like boxing or rugby or heading the ball in soccer, or in the case of accidents and incidents where you bash your head really badly and you might have a bad concussion. Very often you will find that later in life you start having problems with brain function in the area where that lesion was. So one has to be very, very cautious around contact sports. And one of the things I always say to parents is, please don't let your children who play soccer head the ball, because your brain is a very soft and mushy organ in a very unyielding box called the skull. And great damage can be done by repeated knocks to that brain. And then the final example of a type of dementia that I'd like to mention is one that afflicted Robin Williams, who, when he discovered that he had a form of dementia, actually ended up being unable to cope with that knowledge and committed suicide very sadly. And that is Lewy body dementia. It's a type of dementia in which the changes that happen in the brain are kind of related to Parkinson's disease. It's the same protein that builds up in the brain, and very often is associated with seeing, hearing, or feeling things that others can't. So there are many, many forms of dementia. I think the important thing is to become a bit of a detective, to become very observant, to notice changes as they start to occur. And if you are worried, please go and see your doctor. And many GPs are not very specialized in dementia, so it may be a very good idea for you to go and see somebody who has a particular interest in dementia, to be able to sort out whether these things that you're noticing might be leading on to a progressive condition. So when my mum got dementia, I resisted that information for a long time. I wasn't your good student who wanted to know about these things. I was definitely in denial for a long, long time. But there were a couple of things that really helped me as her dementia progressed. One of them was learning more about dementia. Because if we can understand what's going on in the brain, we can understand the behaviors and the changes in abilities that are happening. And that can help us to understand that this is not something where that person is being difficult or ornery. This is something that they cannot help. So this picture of the brain just shows you some of the areas that can be affected, some of the areas I've alluded to already in those pictures of the people affected. And very briefly, I'm just going to highlight 3 areas. The frontal lobe, the pink area in your picture, which, as it says, is responsible for executive functions, for your ability to do complex thinking and planning and organizing, to solve problems. Interestingly, one that we don't often even notice as an ability is the ability to initiate an action, to want to do something and then to start doing it, and allows us to control our behaviors and make choices about what we express, and also our personality. Down below, the yellow ones on the side of your skull, the temporal lobe, that is the area first affected by Alzheimer's disease and is around memory, understanding, and language. And then the green parts, the sort of top rear section of your brain, the parietal lobe, which again are things that we don't often think about as abilities. They're very taken for granted things, like being able to recognize an object and label it correctly. So knowing that's the salt and not the milk. Being able to sequence complex tasks. Now, you might not think that making a cup of tea is a complex task. You think you could do it in your sleep. But if you actually had to describe to somebody who'd never made a cup of tea all the things they need to know and do in order to get that task right, you'd be amazed. And when you can't sequence, it makes it incredibly complicated to do that, what we think is a simple thing. Things like arithmetic and spelling. Now, in my mum's case, I think this part of her brain actually remained quite intact for a long, long time, because she was able to do mental arithmetic till quite far in her dementia, which always surprised me enormously, where other things were falling to bits. So what I'd like to do is now show you a picture of 2 halves of the brain. The one on the right is what we would call a normal brain, a brain unaffected by the shrinkage of dementia. And on the left-hand side, a brain that has shrunk to about 2/3 its original size due to the devastation of nerve cell death and shrinkage due to Alzheimer's. Now, if you can see what is wrong with a person, say, for example, they've had diabetes and part of a leg has been amputated, you wouldn't ask them to run upstairs because it's patently obvious that they can't do what they used to be able to do because something is missing. You cannot see inside a person's skull unless they've had an MRI. And therefore, we can sometimes be very impatient with people with dementia because we cannot actually see how much shrinkage they're actually dealing with, how much they're having to compensate for the losses that have happened in their skull. And so I'd like to just go through a few of the changes that are happening to these people who have a shrinking brain, and invite you to put yourself into their shoes and imagine, in the case of your temporal lobe, if you were no longer able to form new memories. So if somebody told you something now, you could not actually form the memory of what they'd just said because the hippocampus in your brain was not working anymore. Or if you couldn't remember names or simple words. Now, I think I've had dementia all my life because I've got the worst possible memory for names you could imagine. So I know exactly how ashamed I feel and how hard it is when I meet someone I know, but I can't remember their name. And so I think I might be a bit more tolerant of a person with dementia because I have that problem too. In the frontal lobes, imagine if you lost the capacity to solve an everyday problem, to figure out what you need to take with you when you walk out of the door to go shopping, figure out how to write a shopping list, or to practice emotional restraint, to be really angry and you can't stop that anger being expressed, to be really, really sad and you can't stop crying because you can't restrain how you're feeling inside. And then thirdly, in the parietal section, no longer to be able to give a name to your nearest and dearest, to forget how you're related to that person. And as I've already alluded to, forgetting how to make that wonderful cup of tea that you've been so looking forward to. So when people have dementia, what I think we need to remember is that they're doing the best they can with what they have. And if we can possibly use our mental faculties that hopefully are intact to help them through this and to be patient with the changes, that will be such a help. So I've mentioned that one of the things that helped me on my journey with my mum was learning more about dementia and what it's all about physically in the brain. But I also had to learn a lot about the emotions associated with dementia because it's a hugely emotional journey. And one of the things that I'm battling with at the moment in my life is my cognitive dissonance around COVID-19 and how much anger it's brought up in me around things like lockdown and what I consider to be unnecessary changes to society over this time. And so I'm reliving some of the anger I felt about my mother's dementia. And what I had to come to understand is that anger, fear, deep sadness, all the sort of shocking emotions actually have a devastating impact on brain function, on our ability to think creatively, clearly, and also critically, creatively, all of those higher order ways of thinking, because there's two little things in our brain, they're called the amygdala, and they are responsible for what Karen related to previously, which is the fight, flight or freeze response. When we're in a state of threat, our brain actually does something which is really important for survival. It shuts down our thinking brain in order that we can actually defend ourselves or run away as fast as we can from what's threatening us. And so if you see on the left-hand side that very agitated red line, that is a picture of our heart rate variability that happens when we're in a state of shock. And on the right-hand side, that very even blue line is what our heart rate variability looks like when we're in a state of calm. Now, in the case of stressful emotions, inhibit our brain function. When a person with dementia who already has a compromised brain function is feeling stressed, what function remains is compromised by the stress because it is inhibiting their brain function. But if they can enjoy a state of calm, then the function that remains can be enhanced. It can be fully available to them. So one of the things I had to learn during my mother's dementia journey was how my emotions impacted on her, and how if I wanted her abilities to remain as available as they were, I had to do a lot of work on myself to manage my own emotions. So what I want to just speak about now is how changes happening in your loved one with dementia at this time, any time actually, in their mood and behavior are very normal. Because I want you to put yourself into the shoes of these scenarios. And imagine, as you are right now with full brain function, how would you feel? And that's the emotional question. And because our behaviors are often linked to how we're feeling, to our emotions, how would you behave? What would be your reaction if someone you didn't recognize walked into your room, started to undress you, and said that you needed a bath? Just think about that for a moment. How would you be feeling? Someone you don't recognize walks into your room, demands that you undress, and says, I'm going to give you a bath right now. Well, I know how I'd react. I'd probably hit that person on their nose because I would feel intensely threatened. I'm a very private person for a start. Nobody walks into my room and tells me what to do. But that is what's happening every single day, very often, in the home, in the care home, with a family member, with a carer, and with someone with dementia who's forgotten who you are because they have no longer got the capacity to link that face to a name or a memory. Just imagine how frightened that person must be, and out of fear, needing to either run away or protect themselves. Here's another scenario. How would you feel, and how would you behave if you really wanted to know something, but every time you asked, the person you asked got all huffy and impatient with you? Is what they said. I would feel very ashamed. I would feel like really unimportant, and that would make me cross. The person who is asking you that question, who has dementia, has absolutely forgotten that they asked that already 15 times because they can't form that memory. And if it's something they really need to know, I know it's frustrating. I used to get horribly frustrated by my mother, but they really need to know, and they don't need us to react impatiently. This is a big one for me because I love getting up and getting out. You wanted to go for a walk, but every time you went to the door, you were told to go back to your chair and sit down. Oh my word, I'd climb the wall. But this is so true very often when people are busy and they don't want the person to get lost or harmed. And it's easier to manage a person when they're sitting in a room and just sitting down. I would get very, very frustrated. And so if I got frustrated, what would be my reaction? Because I'm a fighter by nature, I would lash out. And so what I want you to just take cognizance of is the fact that the mood and behavior changes that you're seeing as abnormal in your loved one with dementia are perfectly normal. They're about us saying no to people. They're about us frightening people. They're about us controlling people. And elders are adults, and none of us as adults like to be controlled. So how do we stop these outbursts? How do we encourage people out of their shells when they feel like they've been just told to be quiet too often? We have to change our behavior. We have to think about what's the trigger. When we worry about behavioral issues in people with dementia, what is the trigger that has caused that behavior? And if we want to calm a person down, how do we calm down the amygdala in their brain, that little piece that is our survival instinct? And the way we calm one another down is to help one another feel safe, feel calm, and feel loved. Because those are the feelings of belonging to the tribe, belonging to the clan, belonging to the family, and in that state we are safe. So here are a few things to think about if a person is agitated and you're wanting to do something about it. Firstly, on a purely physical basis, are they feeling sick? Are they feeling pain? Are their medications reacting badly with them? Is there something physical that is upsetting them? Consider that first. Then know the person. If they're an introvert and they're being forced to sit in a room with 30 other people all day long, are they actually just needing space? Or are they an extrovert and you expect them to stay in their room all the time because you don't want them to die? They must be going out of their skull by now. They need sociability. What are their likes? What are their dislikes? If I got served bad coffee, I'm afraid I would get really cross. So you need to know that about me so that I will be happy. Look for an unmet need. Do they need the toilet, for example? What are they actually needing right now that they're trying to get, but they're not being understood because they can no longer speak? And look around at the environment. Is there anything physical in their environment that's troubling them? And we'll look at those in a little more detail now. One of the things that we forget is that as people get older and they're more likely to have problems with brain deterioration, other things are deteriorating, like their eyesight. So lighting and contrast become really, really important. So if one wants to keep an elder safe, one has to ensure that visibility is considered. I remember going to a dementia care home a few years ago and walking into the dormitory where the people with dementia stayed and being shocked by the dullness of the lighting. And I thought, if I had cataracts or something, I'd probably fall over the bed because I wouldn't be able to see where I was going. So think about the fact that sight is also deteriorating and the ability to interpret what you're seeing is changing, and consider issues of visibility. One of the things that may happen in dementia as it develops is that you develop more of a sense of tunnel vision. And so if you're looking forward, you might not be able to see what lies beneath you, above you, or to your sides. And so trip hazards become a real issue around safety. Make sure there are no things that will be tripped over, even paving, small tables, rugs that might be tripped over, to keep the person safe. Make sure the person is comfortable. We become more sensitive very often to drafts and sensory stimulation as we get older. So look out for those sorts of things. Is the person cold because their skin is so much more sensitive as they're older? Is the music on too loud? Is that bothering them? Because that would bother me. I have very, very sensitive hearing. And please, 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 people, one of the things that destroys me is when elders are kept indoors and not allowed out. One of the things that feeds our soul, one of the things that gives our vitamin D a boost, one of the things that gets our body clock back into line is being outdoors and experiencing the sun rhythms, experiencing that sun on our face, experiencing the birds, the beauty of nature. Please allow the elders outside. That is where they will calm down. Give them access safely, please. The other piece around safe, calm, and loved is good communication. And from us, that requires us to come into the room in a state of calm friendliness, smile, to be open, to introduce yourself, because the chances are that person may have forgotten who you are. You want them to know who you are, that you love them, and that they are safe with you. They may be battling with their hearing. We forget that as well. They may be battling to remember what you said. So speak clearly, speak simply. Let your tone be positive. Don't ask them things they can't remember. Don't quiz them. Don't ask them the kind of things about what they had for breakfast. They may not remember, and then they'll feel stupid. Don't ask them who they are, who you are. Tell them who you are. Don't ask them what happened last week. They may not know. And then keep communication simple by being maybe one or two people in their presence, because to be in a crowd is very distracting. And if you're talking to them, turn off the radio, turn off the television, turn off distractions. Let them just have that simplicity and immediacy of communication. And then validation. That's a really important word. To be validated is to be heard. It's to be told yes. It's to be told you're right. And we all need that. So please don't try to reel that person back like a fish into your world. They've probably moved into a world which is different from yours. Step into their world and embrace their reality. Say yes to the time zone they're living in. If they're speaking as if they were 7 years old or 25 and they're actually 80, don't worry about it. Those are the memories they have left. Embrace them. Be curious about them. Don't try to correct them. Be with them where and when they are. Don't argue with them, as I've said. None of us like to be corrected. We like to think we're right. And so be with that person in their reality. And if they are sad, be with them in their sadness. If they are angry, acknowledge their anger. If they just want to laugh like a drain, laugh with them. Be with them. If they're going through tough times, just as Karen said, we've all been going through tough times. We know how it feels, and we know how impossible it sometimes feels for us to be happy when we're not happy, to be calm when we're angry. But how much it means to us when a person says, yes, I understand your anger. I understand how you're feeling. I feel like that too. Just be there with them. That's what they need. Try not to say no to their emotions. And then validate what remains. My mother played the piano until she was bedridden 2 weeks before she died at the age of 88, and she'd lived with dementia for 50 years. She could no longer speak. She could hardly walk, but if you put her in front of a piano, she would create music. That is one of those mysteries of dementia. We need to remember the person retains many of the things that make them special, unique, and who they are. And we need to look for those things and encourage those gifts to be shared. Do they love arranging flowers? Do they love kind of working with tools? What do they love doing? Give them that capacity to share their gifts and do what they love. And so just before I end, I want to leave you with something which was one of the most important things I had to learn as a generally quite expressive person, shall I say, a person quick to anger, I had to learn to manage my own emotions. That meant I had to develop a practice, a calming practice, so that before I visited my mother, I would do in the car driving to Somerset West every single time my calming practice, my heart opening practice. So by the time I reached her retirement home, I would be ready to be with her in a heart-centered way and not to be there in a state of grudgingness or irritability. And what I learned was a terribly simple tool called heart-focused breathing. And I'd like to leave you with that tool because we are all in a bit of an emotional state at this long-standing state of lockdown, where we are quick to irritability, we're quick to depression, and we need ways of gathering ourselves and bringing ourselves back to calm. So what I'd like to ask you to do is where you're sitting right now, just uncross your legs, put your feet on the floor, sit back in your chair, straighten your back to give your lungs a bit of space. Perhaps put one hand on your heart, because we're going to be focusing there. And maybe rest the other one up, with the palm uppermost in your lap, because we're going to be in a state of receptiveness. And I'm going to just for a couple of moments lead you through this beautiful technique, which I hope that you'll practice often, to bring yourself into a state where you can be calm and loving with your loved one, so that you can bring them into a state of safety, calmness, and love. So with your eyes closed, I want you to imagine that you're looking into your heart, looking into your chest, seeing your heart lying there, this beautiful heart, and visualize it as a metaphorical heart, something that is not your biological heart, but something beautiful, something that you can be in awe of and give attention to, whatever size, shape, color, texture. Just give attention to your heart for a moment. Shifting your attention out of your busy brain and into your beautiful heart. And then I'd like you to imagine that the next time you breathe in, you imagine that your breath is flowing into your heart, and as you breathe out, flowing out of your heart. I know it's your lungs, but bear with me. Just keeping your attention by focusing on breath flowing into and out of your heart. And as you focus on that flow of breath, just naturally your breath slows a little and deepens a little without any force. Your breath into and out of your heart. And then I'd love you to just make that in-breath and out-breath even. So next time you breathe in, count how many seconds that took. And when you breathe out for the same length. So your inhalation and your exhalation are even. Keeping attention on the breath entering and leaving your heart. Almost sensing that as you breathe in what you're needing. And as you breathe out, you release what no longer serves you. And just for 2 more cycles of in and out breath, and when you're finished, you can open your eyes. And I hope that collectively, wherever we are, in our home, in our workplace, I hope that now we are feeling the calm that we can now go and share with others. Because that's our gift, to bring ourselves into a state that we can share with others. And just before I leave, I would like to remind you that in this very, very difficult and stressful time, we are all doing the best we can. For those of you caring for a loved one with dementia, or fretting about a loved one with dementia who you haven't been able to see for nearly 6 months, you're doing the best you can. They're doing the best they can. The people looking after our loved ones are doing the very, very, very best they can. All of us are doing the best we can. May we be patient with one another and with ourselves. And may all of us just be strengthened. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. I'm feeling very relaxed after that calming session. Thank you. As you mentioned, we are being forced to discuss things that are not all too pleasant, but at least we are starting a thought process and a conversation. Thank you so much for clarifying the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia and how the different forms of the disease have different impacts on functioning. I think, as you mentioned, it is vital to be tuned into your loved one and see and acknowledge small changes which may require medical intervention or assessment. Too often, we do forget to put ourselves in another's shoes, and we do not take into consideration how frustrated a person may become when they are slowly losing their ability to do things that used to come so naturally. We also discussed many possible triggers which could result in frustration. Thinking about things in the environment that may cause discomfort and then correcting them can only assist us in caring for our loved ones. Thank you for your honesty and for sharing your own personal experiences. Okay, we're going to now conduct another quick poll, please. Can you indicate on your screen what you feel would be acceptable and appropriate amount to pay for care in a care centre? Again, this information will allow us to align our services with community needs. So please go ahead and vote. We have various breakup of financial numbers there. So you can click on there and then I will give you the results very shortly. Okay, half the audience has voted. Just a couple more. Okay, we've just ended the polling. All right, the results are as follows. 52% are between the 10,000 and 15,000 Rand brackets, 32% between the 15,000 and 20,000 brackets, and 16% are between the 20,000 and 30,000 brackets. Just to mention that CPOA has many options to assist you with whatever your needs are and whatever your budget is. All right, I am now delighted to announce our last speaker, Professor Patoshnik, who has had a long-standing relationship with CPOA. Professor assists our nursing team in offering educational sessions as well as assisting us with the management of any medical challenges we have within our homes. Professor will be speaking about supplementation of cognitive enhancers. welcome.
Well, a big thank you, Sister Nix, V, the producer, and CPOA for making this possible. The question is essentially, should retirees supplement with cognitive enhancers? And the answer is, in my opinion, is a resounding yes. The rationale for this is that we already use hormone replacement therapy, men feeling lack of drive and apathetic. Testosterone indicates we used to think elderly had of norm low vitamin C levels. Now we know they're needed as an antioxidant. We supplement with vitamin B, especially B12, D, and calcium to prevent osteoporosis. So in the same method, if the brain starts failing, you need to supplement. The issue relies on the gradual decline which affects our physiology and our physical abilities, and this especially erodes our reserves. So we all have reserves, but head injuries can reduce these. Excessive drinking, carousing in your youth, smoking heavily, not looking after physical aspects of your body decreases these reserves, which means that as you go into old age, you're now more vulnerable to effects such as dementia. There are a few things that grow. These don't necessarily help you. The nose grows because of the cartilage mainly. Ears grow because of the cartilage. Feet are thought to grow, but actually don't grow. The ligaments soften both in width and length, and that is why you need larger shoe sizes. So you need to be careful that you don't force them into those twinkle toe shoes you had in your 20s. So enlarge with them. The brain also accumulates things. Unfortunately, these are transmitters which are toxic to the nervous system, such as monoamine oxidase B and glutamate especially, which overexcites the nervous system and causes damage. And for these, we do have medications that help tone it down. And here's your graph to show you how it works. So we improve in function, roughly 20-25, depending on the ability that is called for. So maths, for instance, and you're often in the best in the late 20s. Beyond that, it's said that getting a PhD in maths becomes more difficult. Strength, again, improves with the 40s. So you need to be much older. But on average, let's say that after the age of 40, things start to decline. Then you follow that top line, that brown curve. If, however, now you are starting an early process towards a dementia, you're on the red line. So initially, it will impact on what we call the advanced activities of daily living or complex activities of daily living, then the instrumental ones, and then the basic ones. And that actually encompasses dementia. And what you want to do is narrow that difference and especially slow down the progression of the red line. So by definition, what would we call it? We'd say it's a modest decline, whereas dementia is a significant decline. It's a modest decline in cognition. That's the way we manipulate and use thought process and intellect and other means, our behavior and our function. And these disrupt our social life, our work life. And with this, we require greater effort, or we need compensatory strategies, meaning that we need lists, we need to write down what we're doing for the day, and even a change in accommodation in order to cope. So this mild cognitive impairment, which is also known as dodderiness or age-associated decline, benign senescence. There are numerous terms for it, will affect at least 20 to 30% of the elderly, by elderly being older than 60. And a third of this 20 to 30% will proceed to dementia. And the reason one should consider cognitive enhancers is because we now know from the stats in the United Kingdom that 1 in 3 elderly will actually die with dementia, which is very high. So you may as well treat it early and slow it down early. Here we have PET scans on an amyloid tracer showing the accumulation of amyloid, which is one of the key elements in Alzheimer's, from a very early age. If you look at the extreme left, there are no cognitive changes. There's NC plus, meaning there are mild changes. MC minus, showing the first inklings of mild cognitive impairment. More, plus, plus, even more, and then the switch to Alzheimer's disease. Now, the NC plus on the left-hand side is in your late 20s. So you're living with it already. It's already developing and gradually increasing. Your MC plus, the mild cognitive impairment plus, may only occur at 60 and 65 for MCI plus, and your Alzheimer's finally at 70. So there is some time, there's time to intervene. However, the key factor that can bring it forward or make it go faster is your cardiovascular system. So these are the issues you have to keep in control. High blood pressure, your diabetes if you have it, sugar, your cholesterol. You want to look at your alcohol consumption, your smoking, and lack of exercise, healthy eating, and your intellectual abilities. So these are the key factors that you're looking at already to try and slow down this illness and not help it express itself. So, sorry, we seem to have gone back here. Right, so our mild cognitive impairment is this in-between stage between normal aging and dementia. It's an area where we can prevent or delay the progression of it. We know already that earlier treatment leads to a better prognosis. And this also gives us the opportunity to intervene, do our financial planning, plan wills, sort out our lives, and also to start giving the caregiver the support they need for this journey. The 4 regions that you should look at in particular, and that will show very, very early on that there's a problem. Now, the way to read these graphs is that the 4 domains here, the phoning, the communication, taking transport, taking medication, and doing your finances. And what they did here, they used 1,000 patients that had developed Alzheimer's disease and 100 of them, and then went back into their graphs to see whether they could have picked it up earlier. So this is the graph and the function before the diagnosis of Alzheimer's was made, and that is the naught. So up is worse, and the small stippled line below is normal aging. So normal aging, if you look at your communication skills, they do deteriorate with time, but not nearly as bad as it does in those who are about to dement or being diagnosed with dementia, where it goes up considerably, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. That's your MCI stage prior to the diagnosis. The ability to drive or the ability to take transport or manipulate transport, getting out at the right destination, declines significantly. And this one they can test easily. And it's a very, very good indicator that something's going awry. And as you see, even in normal aging, they don't do too well, but they do much, much worse with the dementia. An interesting one is the one of taking medication, which starts as far back as 7 years before you actually dement. And unfortunately, it's this inability to take medication correctly that often means that you end up with higher care or in a home or with greater supervision whatsoever. So if that at least had been corrected, then we could have slowed down the whole process much, much easier. So administration and help and a caregiver is necessary. The other significant one is finances. And here we've seen many people come to ruin before diagnosis was even made. And already you see that starts well before the 10 years to the dementia. And most elderly is already impaired and on the rise. So remember these four. The other thing is the educational reserve. It's a more tricky one, but we can explain it. But essentially what it means, the top line, that if you've had 16 years of education, so that's usually a matric plus another 4 years, or have been active intellectually to the equivalent, then at 12 years, you will be at the level that someone with only 8 years of education starts off at. So be wary of smart people, technically. They take longer to get to a baseline where you can establish that there is a problem. It also means you can manipulate them more easily in those years to change wills and do things according to your wishes. And you can influence things negatively. So they especially need protection. But they're also the ones who can more easily argue their way out of it. So in other words, if you have a maths teacher, he'll still be good at maths when he's dementing, when in fact, that's his strong point. You should be testing him on other things as well. Can he work an ATM? Can he balance a budget? Can he use his finances adequately? The other indicator you have is that if for the first time in your life you have a severe depression or anxiety disorder at the age of 50, and especially if that occurs and needs repeat treatment, you're at higher risk of a dementia later. So that's the other big indicator that you should do something. There's a subset whereby people have a more active bladder, both during the day and at night, and this is treatable. So we urge these people to come forward, have it investigated, and have it treated. These are the brain graphs that tell us it is there plus the history. So there's your overall graph. This one only goes for a time period of 10 years, and many dementias now survive to 23 or older. So it's a long-term haul. It's very stressful, it's very taxing, and there's a lot to be done. You can definitely slow it down if you start treatment very early. That is your white line above, compared with the red line where the deterioration follows. So these medications, what do they do and where do they work? They work on mild cognitive impairment. They work on Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, diffuse Lewy body dementia, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the important thing to note here is that when you're dealing with mild cognitive impairment, you haven't got the diagnoses of the others. You actually don't know, is it going to go the diffuse Lewy body dementia. So we speak in this stage of a memory problem, and that's technically what it is. It's a memory problem which is affecting your functioning in activities of daily living. And if you treat that already, you can skip out of it or slow it down so that it doesn't progress to a proper dementia. So your treatment range actually starts at 30 out of 30 on your minimental and goes down to about 8 out of 30, after which the medication won't be of any good. And here are your medications. Essentially, the cholinesterase inhibitors, there's 3 of them, and we have an NMDA receptor. So of the 4, you'll need 1 from the first group, 1 of the 3, and 1 in the second group. We have generics for most of them, others on the pipeline. And the combined treatment for mild cognitive impairment, if you're on 1 of each, should be around 350 rands a month. But already, if you only afford 1 of them, you can get away with 150 rands a month with regards to medication. Should there be any mood disorder left or behavioral disturbance, that of course requires additional treatment, but often that's taken care of by the initial cognitive enhancers. The big thing again is to control your cardiovascular risk factors. So we say, fine, if it doesn't cure it, what's it worth? That line between active and placebo makes a huge difference. The caregiver makes a huge difference to the time of placement at home, and makes a huge difference to finances and the well-being of the family. We also know from the Cache County that the caregivers under considerable stress, the caregiver themselves has a 6 times higher chance of dementing, especially if it's that is the lady, the woman looking after the demented husband. And if he's looking after her, his risk is 12 times higher. So what can you do before then? Before this time, what do you do now in your 20s, 30s? Firstly, in menopause, you need hormone replacement therapy. So have that checked out. Have it replaced. Very good agents for this. You need the therapy usually for some 2 years. Anti-inflammatories, we're looking at Brufen, Voltaren, and COX-2 inhibitors, which are effective in delaying it. It doesn't mean that you take them, but if you're already on them for arthritis or whatever other issues, this may be beneficial. You cannot change your genetic makeup, and also remember the genetic makeup is variable in its influence on this process. So we would technically not focus on that or even test for it. Vitamin E may be beneficial, that is less than 300 units per day, and vitamin C, it's 300 milligrams or less, with or without the Brufen, Voltaren, etc. Red wine has been shown to be beneficial because of a substance called resveratrol, and that amounts to some 250 to 500 milliliters a day. That's a third to 2/3 of a bottle a day. Keep yourself intellectually stimulated. In other words, things you do already, keep them going, keep them active. We do not promote learning a new language. A new language is a cortical function, and it's the cortex that's the first thing that's being affected. So people learning a new language when they're dementing are really, really sweating. And we think that stress is counterproductive. Your diet, eat healthily, you know the Mediterranean diet rules. Coffee, it's unfortunately restricted to filter coffee or Nespresso. The reason being that the substance which helps with the coffee, the healthy benefits, is removed during decaffeination or when you instantize the coffee. Chocolate's good for you. So you need the equivalent in cocoa of some 40 grams of a 70 or 80% cocoa bar of chocolate. Physical exercise, excellent. And again, remember, control of your cardiovascular risk factors. Then lastly, it's said that if your dog looks like this, you need to stop driving. Look at the person, see whether you don't need to take them off the road. There are numerous centers now that do the tests for you. We doctors are very happy with that because it means we're not actually banning the driving. The person who's doing the test sends a report and they stop the driving. So it doesn't interfere with our relationship with the family. And the family's also out of it. So keep that in mind. Keep others safe on the road as well. It's not all about you. Thanks a lot. Call it a day.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I guess wine is okay, doctor's orders, and chocolates. As always, a lot of insight and lots for us to consider. All right, usually at this point, we invite you to take a tour of the flagship memory care center at Sea Point Place, but obviously that is not possible. But I have arranged a virtual tour, so please sit back and enjoy the video. CPOA was founded over 65 years ago to help people in their entire journey. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, but we do apologize for the technical issues on that video. Apparently it was lagging a little bit. Well, that concludes our presentations for the morning, and we will now have a question and answer session. We're just moving into our question and answer box, and I will just ask the questions and pose it to the relevant speaker to answer. Okay, the first question is for Prof. And it says, how regularly should people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's be assessed?
We would say at least every 6 months. You're already required by law to have the script renewed every 6 months. The script you've been given isn't valid beyond that period. So it's a minimum of 6 months. And then the actual testing is more tricky. The psychometric department says annually, but seeing that people do forget, you can narrow it down to 6 months. The issue is what you want to do with that. You can have very smart people on testing who are nightmare at home in their behavior. So we look at the overall picture, not just how smart they are.
Thank you. The next question, Dr. Potoshnik. Are you recommending everybody over 60 years takes cognitive enhancers, even with MMSE scores of between 24 and 30?
No, I'm saying we're indicated, and it'll be that 20 to 30% of elderly that will require it. They should come forward, have it assessed, and see whether they need it or not. The only way we can tell whether you're the group of mild cognitive impairment patients where it doesn't progress is through lumbar puncture, CSF tapping, or through the very complex radiographs I showed you, neither of which are available in South Africa. So for the moment, you just go with it and see what happens. And we will pray for you that you do not go into a dementia. But it only applies to some 20 or 30% of the elderly.
Okay, I think that we've got one question here. Will this webinar be available as a recording for reviewing? And we can confirm that it will be available for reviewing. All right, those are the questions for the day. Thank you. All right, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us and spending time with us here today and sharing your knowledge and experiences. I also would like to thank the audience for attending, and we trust that you enjoyed the session with us. Thank you also to the technical team, the behind the scenes team that made this webinar possible. Please be on the lookout for our next webinar, which will be taking place on the 16th of October. Sorry, the 14th of October. This is a CPOA retirement webinar, giving you the insight and breakdown of what you will need for your retirement. For any additional information, please do not hesitate to contact us. The contact details are on the screen at the moment. And then a copy of the presentation will be available and will be emailed to all attendees. Once again, thank you for spending the morning with us, and goodbye.